Hi, everybody. Welcome to Wednesday. Put a little light on the subject. So, today is our very last example of ethnogenesis that we are utilizing to hopefully inspire you to come up with a series of guiding questions for your own examination of ethnogenesis, along with learning something about the Bay Area, your home. And in this effort, we're going to introduce our final subject matter, which is an examination of the Mission District in San Francisco, and an examination also of perhaps one of the most renowned versions of ethnogenesis in major cities in America currently, the G word, gentrification. Yes. So we're going to talk about the mission as an example of gentrification. And then afterwards, I'm just going to do a little bit of business. So let's jump right into it, shall we? Let me pop it up here. All right. The mission. I don't know if anyone has been to the Mission in San Francisco. It's not exactly a tourist attraction, but it certainly is one of the most vibrant neighborhoods in the city. It is a place full of nightlife. It's a place where kind of a burgeoning restaurant scene has really established. And as many of you know, the Bay Area, and specifically San Francisco, is a foodie destination, certainly one of the culinary capitals of the world. And the Mission has been contributing to that in a contemporary way as of late. But let's just jump right into it, because for many people who have been to the Mission, they might think of it as kind of the notable Latinx neighborhood in San Francisco. Others, they would actually say it's a lesbian enclave. Others would say it's an artist enclave. Others would say that it's become a haven for tech bros, young tech graduates from colleges like Berkeley and Stanford and Santa Clara, who live in the area because of its kind of cultural dynamics, its access to great dive bars and music venues, and bomb-ass burritos. Arguably the best burritos in America. A lot of people make that argument, that San Francisco in general has the best burrito, whereas Los Angeles has the best tacos. Who knows? Burritos aren't really Mexican anyway, right? They're indeed a hybrid food for field workers who were largely of Mexican descent, and has become a cuisine. And of course, everyone in San Francisco will argue over which is the best burrito joint. It just happens to be La Taqueria, but that's for you to know and for them to argue. But let's start with the concept of ethnogenesis that we're exploring today. Indeed, gentrification. You have heard this term, I'm sure. And so what I've done is provided as objective definition as possible, because it largely has a pejorative connotation, as you know, and is wielded usually in a negative context. But just the denotative kind of identity of gentrification is a general term for the arrival of wealthier people in an existing urban district, a related increase in rents and property values, and changes in the district's character and culture. Now, that typically looks like immigrants and low-income people of color who managed to stay in cities after the Great White Flight, which we talked about last week, right, in the 50s and 60s, with this kind of emergence of cities becoming popular again, becoming desirable for young folks, particularly my generation, Gen X, wanted to come back into the cities, those people had more money. They typically are of a middle or upper middle class and largely associated with being white. So that's usually what we see in terms of what the gentrification looks like. Okay. And I just have a note here. The term is often used negatively, suggesting the displacement of poor communities by rich outsiders, and again, largely white. And you can see I just got this from Flag Wars. Let me just make sure everything is still recording. Okay. So, the mission. Just to give you an idea, we've talked about Chinatown, which is right here. Yum, 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 right? A little bit of North Beach we talked about. We talked about the Tenderloin, which is right here. We talked about the Fillmore, which is right here. We talked about the Castro, which is down here. The Mission is adjacent to it. And the Mission has a very unique character. For one, it survived the 1906 earthquake. So the fire did not get down this far. And also, it was a newer community at the time. But a lot of the buildings from that era survived. And we're dealing with a mostly low-rise neighborhood of roughly 2 to 3 stories in that old kind of Italian style, but also variegated with other architectural styles kind of throughout. It is flanked on one side by Mission Dolores Park, which I highly recommend. It is one of the most interesting public spaces in America, where it has its own kind of economic structure and brings together so many different communities. Because, as I was referring to earlier, in the 50s and the 60s, this working class area, after the Great White Flight, begins to emerge as an immigrant enclave for primarily Central Americans, largely from Mexico, but then other countries in Central America. And so it fast becomes the Latinx enclave in San Francisco, among others. It kind of looks like this. It is a very colorful, very pedestrian and flat area of the city. And if you know anything about San Francisco, typically you're associating it with hills, right? That make your ass look really good by climbing up them all the time. But the Mission is a flat area. It's a valley area. And it also is one of the warmer parts of the city. So it's important to note that there are roughly like 18 to 30, depending on who you talk to, microclimates in this small 7x7 area, largely due to the marine influences of the ocean and the bay influences, being a peninsula, and of course the hills. And so almost each kind of rise and fall of the hills creates its own microclimate. The Mission happens to be one of the warmest. Okay? And it is also one of the most colorful neighborhoods. In fact, the Mission is known to be the highest concentration of public murals in the entire United States. There are roughly 2,000 in the area. It's a pretty big part of the city, but still, we have art everywhere. This happens to be the women's building, or El Edificio de las Mujeres, which was the very first women's building and organization, women's service organization ever created in the United States. And it was public services for women, it was health services, psychological services, has managed to hold that position in the community for over 50 years. So, pretty special building. I've also just added some murals that I've just taken from around the town. But I highlight this one in particular because a lot of the muralismo the mural culture is bound in social justice. Many of you are probably familiar with Cesar Chavez and the workers movement. So yes, that primarily was centered around the agricultural kind of economy of the Central Valley. However, the Mission District in San Francisco became kind of the center for Latinx life. Of course, there was one in LA as well, but there was a different kind of character to the one in San Francisco. It had more of a political and socially minded sensibility. And so a lot of Cesar Chavez's organizing had its kind of satellite and well, indeed, headquarters in San Francisco. And the Mission District is where this kind of centered most. So a lot of the kind of political and social organizing that surrounded the workers' movement happened in the city. And so we see that kind of sensibility and legacy extended into the community and specifically in the art, the public art of the neighborhood. And so you can see how kind of civic-minded, how political, how identity-oriented this mural is in particular, and even more so the next one, which is just gorgeous, right? I mean, you can see that there is like references to Mazatlan and Mixta in this mural. So a kind of relationship to origins of the Chicano and Latinx communities that migrated to this part of the city. And not only seeing the history in this mural, but kind of the legacy of the people, right? The legacy of la gente. Oh, and by the way, in the bottom right corner is La Taqueria. You'll never find it. Ha ha ha. The best burritos. Here's another one I just like, right? You can kind of see the socio-political, the historical, all kind of bound in some kind of narrative muraling. And you can imagine this is one of the reasons why so many people love the Mission. It is dynamic with art and culture. It has the flavor of the Latinx community. And in addition, because the area was fairly cheap because of the Great White Flight in the 50s and 60s, by the 70s and 80s, we start to see other communities that also need to live cheaply, namely lesbians, right, who couldn't afford the Castro or didn't feel like they could be a part of the very male-centered nature of the Castro, which we talked about last week. And of course, women making less money anyway, they needed something that was perhaps proximal to the neighborhood of the Castro as a way to kind of navigate the resources of it and the safety of it, but at the same time couldn't afford it. So along Valencia Avenue, which now, of course, is famous for its restaurants and bars, there was a very large lesbian contingent with lesbian bars lining the streets in the area. At one point, the most lesbian bars that the world has ever seen. Now, unfortunately, there are none. That's for a whole other conversation. Maybe that's an ethnogenesis project, right? But in addition, other types of people who didn't really have a lot of money, but really enjoyed and felt compelled by the cultural and artistic character that the Latinx community brought to the neighborhood. And that would naturally be artists. San Francisco was already a fairly expensive city by then. And so many artists flocked to this relatively inexpensive area and began to cohabitate with the Latinx community, which is a lot of families, a lot of immigrants, the lesbian community, and of course themselves. And even though we can never paint a portrait of Camelot where everyone got along famously, we do see for about 30 to 40 years a relative harmony between these three communities existing in the Mission. Now, let's think about this. Up until the 90s and even into the early 2000s, we have an area that is rich with culture, rich with art, rich with acceptance, one of the warmest parts of the city, where you have lots of different options for entertainment and culture, art and food, and to boot, there is a subway that runs under the Mission in this neighborhood. So it's even very accessible as well. Naturally, it's going to begin to attract people who perhaps have even more means, who are also drawn to kind of the cultural capital that the neighborhood has fostered. You see where I'm going with that. This is where gentrification comes in. Now, something else happens in the 2000s, we all know, and that is the emergence of tech. For a while, Silicon Valley really concentrated itself in the South Bay, namely around Santa Clara and Stanford campuses, right? That area was where most of the tech resided. These startups would emerge and, their company headquarters would be there as well. And a lot of these techies would kind of congregate in the area. They would live close by. But as tech really ascended, as tech became bigger and bigger and bigger, and especially with 2.0, they call it, which is the dawn of smartphone technology and social media and app culture, when that emerged, there was such an influx of labor that was needed for all of these fledgling companies. And much of that labor was young. And young people by then didn't want to live in the bedroom communities of the South Bay. They didn't want to live in suburban culture. They wanted the excitement of the city. And they wanted to live in San Francisco. Now, what the Mission also had was a Caltrain stop. 2 of them, actually. And that meant that workers who wanted to live in the city, if they lived close to Caltrain, could easily access the South Bay and the peninsula where all the companies were relatively easily. And once again, we see kind of the attraction to the Mission. And in the early teens in San Francisco, we saw an influx of young, well-paid techies looking to rent places in desirable parts of the city. And what we have is an incredible explosion of rent costs, right? San Francisco is dense. San Francisco is also more European in style. It's not Manhattan in the fact that there are tons of towers where housing is, right? We have a lot of 100-plus-year-old Victorians and Italianate style structures. And so there's limited space. But with this tech boom, we saw anywhere between 80 and 200,000 new workers coming in the last decade. And this is just in the last decade. So you can see in spring of 2015 even, look at the prices here. Here is the Mission. Yeah. San Francisco quickly became the most expensive city in America. And that had not happened prior. It was an expensive city because it's always been beautiful and desirable. But Manhattan always far exceeded San Francisco. Not anymore. The last 5 years plus have seen the city be the most expensive, with average rents hovering in between $3,000 and $4,000 a month. Yeah. And this relatively affordable pocket of the city, the Mission, now started ballooning. And even though this happened all over the city in general, and largely wherever there was public transit, and you can see that mainly on the east side here, where my cursor is going over, the deep red. This is where it was most shocking. This is where it was most noteworthy. And you can see all the areas that surround the mission and the mission itself. I mean, look at these percent increases from one year to the next. And this is supposed to say 2013, sorry. But you can see just the radical differences in the average rent cost just in 1 year. Remember, this is the popularization of so many things. Instagram, right? The boost of YouTube, Twitter, Uber, Lyft, all headquartered in the Bay Area, and many of them beginning to move into the city to serve this new group of laborers who also wanted to live there, right? So we have companies like Salesforce and Instagram, Uber, Lyft, all headquartered in the city. And so we just saw like a major population explosion of young people with disposable incomes who were willing to pay these prices because they wanted to have the experience of being able to work, get paid really well, go to the bar after work, and get a bomb-ass burrito next to their apartment late at night. Yeah? And so with the tech bro emerges as kind of like an enemy, right? Even though, of course, the tech bro didn't know that they were contributing to such high costs of this form of gentrification. Okay. Then we have to talk about another potentially nefarious force. The landlords. San Francisco is largely a rental city, much like Manhattan. The cost of housing to buy is astronomical. And because they're both kind of migrant cities, right, where people come in to pursue their dreams kind of deal, like Los Angeles and New York, we don't have a lot of housing stock for sale. It's mostly rent. Now, luckily, prior to this, San Francisco has one of the most stringent rent control laws in America and was the birthplace of rent control on the West Coast. But greed always has a way of finding a loophole. And that loophole is the Ellis Act. The Ellis Act was established just as a way for landlords to evict tenants if they wanted to go out of business, right? If you had a property and you wanted to get out of the rental business, the Ellis Act would allow you to evict tenants so you could sell your property. Obviously, having tenants in there isn't as attractive, right? To sell the property anyway. You want to go out of business. It was to protect landlords who wanted to get out of the rental game, which makes sense. There's nothing about that is unethical. However, the way it was utilized during this time, well, it was abused. So you can read here. The Ellis Act is a state law which says that landlords have the unconditional right to evict tenants to go out of business, which otherwise would be unlawful. So for an Ellis Act eviction, the landlord must remove all of the units in the building from the rental market, and it is commonly used to change an apartment building from rentals to condos. However, the oversight of whether a building was converted to condos was not really part of municipal governance. And so a lot of landlords began to initiate the Ellis Act, and their LLC, their kind of corporation of individuals, would go out of business. But then they would just sell it to another LLC that they were also a part of. And so it became a way to jack the rents up when they went back on the market. And this became an abuse, largely facilitated by lawyers, and in particular one law firm, Bornstein and Bornstein, who started charging for seminars to teach landlords how to use this loophole, which was intended to protect landlords to be able to sell to go out of business, to transfer their properties over, let them go dormant, only then to evade the rent control laws that were in place. It was an ugly business. Let me just make sure that we're still going. Okay. And we largely see this happen during this tech explosion. So you notice here, other than that big blop that you just saw, we hardly have any Ellis Act, right? Because it was mainly used just, like I said, just when landlords were going out of business. However, by 2014, all of a sudden we see a ton of Ellis Acts. It was like a rash of Ellis Acts that, like, all of these landlords going out of business. Like, what the hell? How could so many people be going out of business? Well, they weren't. They found the loophole and their greed kind of took them over. And you can see how so many of these acts, even though all over the city, are highly concentrated right in the Mission. Yeah. That's kind of where we're at the moment. It's a sea of red, huh? As a result of this, the tech industry becomes enemy number one in San Francisco. By 2013, there was so much vitriol, so much kind of negative feelings about these young, kind of earnest, highly paid tech workers, and how many people thought they were ruining the city. One, because they didn't necessarily adopt a lot of the artist and activist sensibility that had kind of characterized San Francisco since the 50s. That they were largely seen as consumers, but also that they were willing to pay such high prices for apartments, which meant that the abuses would continue. And it would push out, of course, the people that could no longer afford to live there. And that was largely the Latinx community and their families, artists, lesbians, people that didn't make a lot of money. And there was a major divide that occurs. I want to show you a video that was largely inspired by this conflict that was developing between San Franciscans that had been there before the tech boom and then San Franciscans who arrived during the tech boom. This is called Google Apps, and it's a parody video. And it, for some reason, is not working, so I'm going to look it up real quick. Oh wait, maybe it'll work this way. This video may be inappropriate. So this is images, Google images of the Mission District from 2015. And this is Persia, an activist, artist / drag queen who is from the neighborhood.
Twitter me, Facebook me. Hey girl, did you tag me in that pic? Silicon Valley, Silicon Valley. Hey girl, did you get that eviction notice? Google apps, Google apps, gringa, apps. I just wanna be white. Google apps, Google apps, gringa, apps. I just wanna be white.
I wanna be white, Daddy. Daddy, please.
For Christmas, girl, for Christmas. Queers, all the queers, we're on the move. Hey girl, where the fuck are you moving to? Moving to the East Bay, living life the broke way. SM, keep your money. Fuck your money. Google apps, Google apps, gringa, apps. I just wanna be white. Google apps, Google apps, gringa, apps. I just wanna be white.
How does one become white? A little bleach might do the trick. Will I bleach my asshole? Does that count?
I don't know.
Wanna see? Duh. Bye.
Techies, take the mission. Techies, gentrify me, gentrify my love.
So, thanks for hanging in there. That was a good illustration of the sentiment that people, namely Latinx, queer, and artistic folks, which Persia, the drag queen, artivist, performer, represents all three of those communities, was feeling about the encroachment of the tech industry onto these kind of San Francisco neighborhoods that had largely not seen this kind of gentrifying force to such magnanimity until the last several years. This all comes to a head with a series of protests that begin called the Google Bus protests. So a lot of these tech companies, knowing full well that their labor force, this kind of burgeoning young labor force, wanted to live up in the city, tried to come up with ways to make it attractive to still work down in Silicon Valley. And also, I think in some ways, to mitigate the rise of heavy traffic as a result of so much commuting going along the peninsula between San Francisco and a lot of these headquarters, like Google and Apple and Facebook, etc. So they began chartering these kind of large buses that, were kind of luxury. Many of them would have like a little cafe on them. They would have Wi-Fi. They were air conditioned with plush seats, as a way to entice the workers to, one, work down in the Silicon Valley, and two, to be able to enjoy the fact that they wanted to live in the city as well, right? So it's like a perk, an incentive. And it was probably just intended for that. However, these buses were largely picking up their workers at the same stops as municipal buses, which of course are not as nice, right? That serve the rest of the city population. Might be a little smelly. You might have a houseless person on there who hasn't taken a shower in a while, or you get a melange of different kinds of people on the public bus. And this kind of symbol of like this bougie bus that was made for the tech workers, utilizing the same public resources, the bus stop, as the Muni bus, it was the final straw for a lot of San Franciscans. And soon, protests began to emerge where protesters would block what were kind of labeled as Google buses. They would block them. They would, as you see here, deliver epithets to this community. And in one case, during a counterpulse, which was one of the artivist groups who were protesting the Google buses, during one of these encounters, one of the protesters with counterpulse, perhaps in a moment of just sheer anger, picked up a rock and threw it at the window of the Google bus and broke the glass. No one was severely injured, but it was more of a symbolic gesture that somehow this irritation, this conflict, had finally reached a moment of actual violence. And that's when the city started to really pay attention to what was going on, and city leaders started to decry a need to make change. That this kind of class disparity that was so evident in places like the Mission needed to be addressed in order to make the city feel like a home for all again. The city has been in many different battles and discussions and debates about how to somehow mitigate this challenge. For example, there was a prop on the California ballot to extend rent control to all rental buildings in California. It failed, right? But every single year that there's been an election, there has been some kind of housing housing proposition made either locally in San Francisco or statewide to attempt to find some resolve in order to make the city and the Bay Area as a whole be a place for all income brackets to live in. But that's an ongoing issue. But what we see is a noteworthy example of gentrification of our time, largely influenced, but not entirely, by the high-paying labor class of the tech industry, and how that is affecting San Francisco, and in particular the Mission District. We have seen a lot of evictions of Chicano and Latinx families from the Mission. There certainly has been a decline, and many mourn. Of course, you read about these in the readings that were assigned for today. But that is a brief overview of what's going on in the Mission currently to this day. All right. Now, the last thing I wanted to mention to you before I let you go for the day is that you are preparing your ethnogenesis visualization project, which is going to involve you doing your preliminary research on whatever subject matter you come up with. Many of you have already talked to me, and that's exciting, about your ideas. You're certainly welcome to do that. Send me an email so that we can kind of chat to come up with a guiding question for your research. Many of you already know what you're doing and you've already started, and that's great. This visualization is a chance for you to just, like I said on Monday, assemble your research in some kind of formulation to figure out, okay, what is it that I really want to write about? And then in the early part of next week, Monday and Tuesday, we are setting up one-on-one conferences to discuss your ideas. So you're going to submit your visualization project on Friday, and that gives me time to look over your initial ideas, and then you're going to sign up for one of the one-on-one conference times that is located in Pages in your Camino. I'm going to make an announcement that sends you a link right to it. By Friday of this week, please sign up for a session. They are mandatory, so please do it. Sign up for a session. And then next week, you don't have any assignments other than just working on the first draft of this research paper. And so Monday or Tuesday, we'll chat. We'll give you some direction. Hopefully I inspire you to go in a more specific way into whatever your topic is going to be. And then you have the week to really compose this draft. So make sure that by Friday you sign up for one of the one-on-one conferences. Okay? And then, of course, on Friday, submit your ethnogenesis visualization. And from there, we'll start to chat and shape this paper into the best thing you've ever written. Good luck, everyone. Have a wonderful day.